Hola, hola, amiga. On this week's episode, we welcome Ariana Taboada again to the show. If you haven't yet heard our first conversation with her, which was episode 41, Ariana is the founder of The Expecting Entrepreneur, a consulting firm that helps entrepreneurs design parental leave plans that meet their business model and personal needs. On this week's episode, we cover a wide range of topics from deciding when it's the right time to return to work after parental leave to handling the mental shift between professional roles and motherhood. We address the financial and emotional implications of these life altering phases, uncovering strategies for new and experienced mothers alike. Throughout the conversation, Ariana provides tips on how to navigate this transition, stressing the importance of support, setting boundaries, and addressing the emotional implications of these decisions. I love how Ariana underscores the importance of effective planning ahead of time, seeking help, and addressing individual needs as you prepare towards the end of your maternity leave. Whether you're contemplating the balance of work and parenthood, or you're a seasoned pro looking for a fresh perspective, join me as Ariana brings wisdom, clarity, and a comprehensive understanding of the complex world of maternity leave. No te pierdas this insightful conversation. Welcome to the Viva la Mami podcast. I am your host, Jessica Cuevas. I am a mother of two on a mission to help redefine the meaning of motherhood as a modern Latina mom. Motherhood can be a complex journey, interwoven in two identities that often make us feel ni de aquí ni de allá. Viva la Mami is committed to providing you with knowledge, tools, and support to navigate the challenges and triumphs of motherhood as Latina moms. On the show, we'll be discussing culturally relevant topics that will help inform and empower you in whichever season you are in on your motherhood journey. We'll be joined by Latina moms, experts and professionals who can offer advice, practical tips, relatable stories, and honest conversations. So bring your cafecito as I invite you to be a part of this space as we create comunidad about the exciting and challenging parts of being a mommy. Ahora, vámonos. Hola, hola, Ariana. How are you?
Hola, Jessica. I'm good. Good to be back here with you.
Yes, thank you so much for being here again. For the listeners who haven't had a chance to go to our first interview with you about how to prepare for maternity leave, I really encourage you to listen to that episode, which I'll put it in the show notes. But this episode, this conversation will be specifically about how to prepare after your maternity leave. So it's almost like you're kind of done with your leave. Okay, what does that look like? And so, being that you are an expert about all things parental leave for mamas, for parents, for entrepreneurs, I'm like, I need to have Ariana again. And that way you can better inform us about what it's like once you're done with your parental leave. And so the first question I have for you is there a specific time to go back to work after maternity leave? Like, what are the usual recommendations that you typically inform your clients?
Yeah, so this is like the golden question oftentimes of like how, especially for first time parents. So I just wanted to frame the reality in the States that, there are over 100 million people, working people who don't have access to even a day of paid leave. And so a lot of people are having to make choices around leave under very hard circumstances. And many people go back to work within like 10 days of having given birth. So, like,
Wow.
2 working weeks. As you can imagine, low income workers, gig workers, communities of color are particularly hard hit. And Latinas are overrepresented in that statistic of going back to work within 10 days. With one thing to keep in mind is sometimes quote unquote knowledge workers, so people who have professional degrees or college degrees or who are working outside of service jobs, then you will often hear kind of 12 weeks referred to as like, oh, that's the normal time. 12 weeks is aligned with the Family Medical Leave Act, but it's not actually based on any data that we have around what recovery time is like. So our research indicates that 6 months is the optimal time because it includes time for postpartum recovery for those who gave birth. It covers bonding and early infant attachment, which includes, it can be particularly important for those who are breastfeeding. And it also, those 6 months, there's been some really interesting research around how it correlates to workplace productivity upon return. And a lot of people are like, there's no way that I can take 6 months, right?
Yeah.
So I default back to like, take as much time as you have available. Sometimes that might be 10 days, and sometimes that might be 6 months. And for those who are in full-time roles with an employer, you can oftentimes kind of patchwork it together. So some family medical leave, you might be in a state that has a state program. You might be able to do things like pool together paid time off or have people donate their paid time off towards you. It's a little different for entrepreneurs. Oftentimes it's more of a patchwork of figuring out what you can kind of bank and create a cushion around. But again, I'll default back to like, if you can figure out more than 10 days, you're doing better than most of the country. If you can get towards that 6 months, that is going to cover an incredible amount of recovery and attachment and setting yourself up for kind of positive health outcomes, and including mental health.
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, it's just mind boggling that a lot of folks have 10 days usually, and especially in service oriented fields, or how you mentioned that most of this population are women of color. I'm not surprised, but it's just not fair how the system is really, and how it almost works against the American values, where families are put to like this standard of like this priority, but then again they don't consider the recovery process and the bonding process, and how you mentioned that there is research that is backed up where it's at least 6 months. 6 months is like kind of like the golden amount of time for, people to take leave. And I was also curious about entrepreneurs. Really, does it kind of depend on their time? Does it depend on what they have in place in terms of like their own like goals or strategic plan? Can you kind of inform us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I'd say the main difference for entrepreneurs is that oftentimes they don't have a company policy that sets up an amount of time and clear expectations. So a lot of times they're trying to figure out, what could I just financially swing? What, depending on how large their business is, if they have employees, if what their profit margin is. There's a lot of financial planning involved in, for anyone, but for entrepreneurs particularly, that their family expenses and their business financials are so closely tied to each other. It can be a lot of financial planning up front to figure out what's the amount of time that I can afford to take off, and what does it look like to keep my business running and keep it growing if it's in a growth mode, or kind of on maintenance and sustaining at the level that the business is, if it's in the kind of later stages of business.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do want to put a plug out there. You did write a book for the expecting entrepreneur. Do you have any mention of that in as far as with like returning back from leave, and kind of like your recommendations?
Yeah. So there's what we were just talking about, the financial planning side. There's a whole chapter on financial planning for leave for entrepreneurs. And then there is a chapter on the return to work. And I often say it's kind of it's like the one silver lining of entrepreneurship and maternity leave, that even though for the leave itself, there's very little resources, you aren't often faced with the same constraints of being in an employer, where it's like you're 100% on leave one day and you're expected to be 100% back at work the next day. So there's a little more flexibility in creating a return to work plan and phasing back in a way that is I always like to say, like, a little more humane. Like, it is a major transition to be going back to work after having a kid. And we can ideally set up the systems and structures for that transition to really be kind of a gradual transition back into that role and that mindset, and to bring those two identities together of being a entrepreneur and being a parent.
Right, right. Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about that in a little bit, about that duality, if you will. But as far as with when one is kind of like at the end of their leave, and I think for me personally, I decided not to go back to my 9 to 5 job days before the end of my parental leave. But good thing I was able to take personal time off, which extended to 30 days. So it kind of allowed myself to really reflect and think whether if I should return to work or not. And I ended up not returning back, which I'm glad I did, but we're also in this very unique situation as well in our lives where we were able to do that because we no longer have a mortgage necessarily. We bought an investment property and we're kind of like house hacking, if you will. And so, however, for those that are still not sure, or, when should you really start to think about whether to return back from work or not?
You gave such a great example in your story about how sometimes we might not know what the choice we want to make is until we're a day away, a week away, and we're realizing how we actually feel about that choice. And you have your baby in front of you, and you have all the other things that are factoring into the decisions. So one exercise that people can do, and I talk about it in my book, is scenario mapping, playing out, usually in the second trimester, just taking some time to brainstorm and think about what would it look like if I was in the scenario where I was going back to work in X number of weeks or months from now. And then playing out what would it look like if I actually was not going back. And there's other options too of what would it look like if I went back on the job market? What would it look like if I looked for a part-time role? And so giving yourself the chance to like imagine what are the actual options here, because sometimes we fall into the binary of like, I either go back or I don't, and I have to make a decision about it like now, or I have to figure out what it is that I'm going to do. And that can be really hard when you're in a situation with lots of uncertainty and lots of changing factors that might affect what you ultimately figure out is right for you and your family.
Right. Right. I appreciate you sharing that you wrote a piece in your book about that, because I think oftentimes we get influenced by like people, especially as Latinas, and I hear it both ways. I was a working mom with my first. I went to work after my maternity leave, and I worked there up until now, right? Now that I had my second. And so I know what that's like in terms of returning back to work and then deciding not to. And for me, now that I have two, things are a lot different. And I can't even imagine going back to work with two. Kudos to all the mamas out there, because I don't know how they do it with navigating, like, just going back to work, but also taking care of two children, making sure that they end up wherever they end up going, whether if it's with the abuelitas or daycare, school, whatever. And yeah, that in itself just is very overwhelming. And yeah, and I think that there needs to be more support for working moms just in general, but that can be another conversation to have. You mentioned about this identity, right, as working professionals, but also as moms. And so how can we be ensured that moms are well supported after maternity leave?
Yeah, so this is a topic that I absolutely love. And I actually, after writing the book, I ended up developing out a whole course on a mindful return to leave, specifically for entrepreneurs. But I have a partner who also offers the course for Spanish speakers, for people in the UK. And so I'm happy we can drop a link to that in the show notes for people who are
Absolutely.
explicitly looking for support around the return to work. And there's 5 things that I often lift up as kind of key pillars of thinking about that return to work after maternity leave. The first is addressing health needs, and that includes physical and mental and emotional health, because one of the hardest things is going back to work when you are physically in pain or emotionally in pain. And so finding ways to, I know, like you said, the logistics of it can be crazy, but to, if you're having pain, to get it looked at, to get it checked out, to, work with a pelvic floor physical therapist if that's what you need, to figure out how you might access mental health care that would be supportive, and figuring out how to weave that into a work schedule, for example. So that's the first thing. The second is childcare logistics. I mean, when you talked about the, the like logistical challenge of having a second child, I have a friend who often says like 1 + 1 child equals like 87 children logistically. And there's so many things to think about. So like a specific example is I often encourage people to have your first day of childcare routine, like you said, whether that's with family or at a center or with an in-home care provider, to actually do that the week before you have to go back to work, because then you have a chance to like test out the routine, and your kid can have a little bit of time to adapt and you can have a little bit of time to adapt. So that's the second. The third is support generally. And that might look like at a community level, like being in a new parent group, but it might also be at work. I know one of my biggest lifelines has been working parent community, and knowing that there's kind of a group of people who I can talk to in a work context about some of the parenting things. So it's less of a like dividing line between work things and home things. And they weave together, and being able to show up as a parent in a work context. And the last two are knowing your boundaries for yourself and being able to communicate those in a work setting and also with family. And then the last is really just honoring the transition time. So I mentioned before, like it's hard to feel like 1 minute you're 100% on mom duty and with your family, and the next day you're supposed to be 100% back in this totally other role, and allowing yourself some grace to think of it as a transition time and know that it's not necessarily going to be like a 180 switch, or be able to flip that light switch on and off in terms of how you show up and what role you're playing.
Yeah, and for me, that was very difficult to navigate, I think, with my first, because I was a new mom, right? And for me, I felt like it was just hard to let go, I think, because I wanted to be in control. And I still do. Maybe that's why I decided not to. But yeah, I think it's a really good point that you mentioned about leaning in for support, your community, your partner. I think that is very helpful, especially as we start work, and when we're like, I think we shouldn't just put ourselves as individuals who can do it all, right? And that often brings out that narrative, right, about being the super mama, and that we should do everything and anything that we could to ensure that our kids are safe, fed, and everything. And so I think it is important to really consider, building a support system, like you said. And I really appreciate you laying that out as part of your pillars, to remind working professionals that there is help out there. It's just a matter of, like you said, giving yourself grace and knowing the season that you're in too. Because especially when they're babies, I think that is very challenging. And then once you get into the flow of things do work out. And that's something that I definitely experienced with my first. And I think that there were a lot of emotions for me specifically, where in the first year, I loved my job. I loved being there. I think that I was just like this completely different person. But then as soon as like 4 p.m. hit, it's like, oh, I got to go through like commute. Oh, now I'm this like mom mode, right? And so how can you really navigate that duality of, being this working professional in the workplace, but then you all of a sudden change that role into mom, partner, wife, all of the above when you go back home. How can one overcome those emotions, I think, of that duality?
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, the first thing I'll just normalize what, in mental health speak, we might call high emotionality. Like, yes, there's a lot of feelings and that is normal. And not just because there is a lot of context switching and a lot of demands on you, but also because you might be sleep deprived. You might be hungry. You might have all of these human needs that, because early motherhood demands so much of you, that some of your needs might not be getting met. And oftentimes our emotions can show us that insight of where we have unmet needs. And so I often, in terms of those transition periods, you're never going to get like a 2 hour magical chunk of time before work and having to like go into mom mode. So looking for the micro moments is something that I often think about. So whether that's like the 2 minutes where you get in your car and you have not started driving yet, and you're just like, I am going to take a deep breath. And that is kind of my transition moment. Or some people I know that work at home and like don't have a physical transition or a commute to go through will have something like they will smell an essential oil on their desk, and that's just permanently there. And like that is the transition moment of like, okay, I'm gonna turn the work stuff off. I'm gonna shift into this other mode now. Sometimes it can be a song that you like play on your drive home or on your commute home, of a song that will like be kind of a portal to that other world, that other reality that you're stepping into. And so like ways that are under 5 minutes to kind of deal with the transition, I would think of as both the most realistic, but also surprisingly like simple and powerful.
That is awesome. I never thought about that. So that is great. And so, for those that decide not to return back to work, how and when can one approach this conversation with their employer? And for me, I felt like it was too sudden, but that's because I'm someone that never wants to burn bridges, and I think I'm such a people pleaser that I was like, yeah, I'm going to go back to work because that's what it is, and I don't want my boss to hate me. But then I had to come with this like reality, like I don't think this is going to be possible, and considering this change that we're doing, I think this is a great time. But for folks that maybe in a different situation, or who have been contemplating about it, but they're just afraid to confront their employer or manager, like when is it typically a good time to approach this conversation?
Yeah. So, like you, I often think about the like maintaining positive relationship approach. Like, how am I going to do this without burning bridges? And in that case, I often try and put myself in their shoes of like, what is the what is the way that I could let them know that considers how they might react? I mean, you're not responsible for other people's emotions or reactions, but thinking through what might they need, or what questions might come up for them when I announce this news. Maybe it's like, well, who's gonna do the job, or who else on your team might be able to fill the role that you will be leaving. Because for most people, they have been out on leave. Sometimes it's again a silver lining moment where you're like, oh, I actually set up a bunch of things to help fill my role while I was out. And so part of the like interim plan could be, I am going to leave, and I make the recommendation of this person continue doing that person fill this gap. And so just doing some thinking that can help address some of the fears that will come up for that person can be useful. And also just knowing that like letting yourself go there of like, what is the worst thing that could happen? if,
Yeah.
if the worst thing that could happen is they like get mad and hate me, or like they fire me, so what, I'm leaving anyway, like letting yourself go to that worst place and then be like, could I deal with that? How would I deal with that? What are the people who would support me through that? And usually you can realize that even in the worst case scenario, it is one that we will be able to come out on the other side of without, major harm or damage to our career or to our kind of sense of self.
That's a really good reminder. Yeah, I remember Googling when is the best time to let your boss know that you're not returning to work. And yeah, there were just like a mix of answers, I think. And so I think that there isn't a perfect moment necessarily, but I would have to agree it's a matter of making sure that you don't burn those bridges because eventually you may have to go back to work sometime in the future. You may need that recommendation or referral, and I think that's very important. And as far as with, I guess two different scenarios, right? And I've heard from other mamas where they are on maternity leave and they cannot contact their employer because they either shut down their email, they just wanted to allow that break and honor it, which I'm all for it, where, it's just hard to access their manager. And then for other moms who go back to work, but they then realize that, no, I actually don't want to do this. Like, do you have any recommendations for those different scenarios?
When I think about, well, what are some of the scenarios that have come up, and I come back to what is the way that I can be most clear and upfront about my decisions and also take accountability for whatever impact that is going to have in my business and with my colleagues. And so when I think about the first scenario of really having like a wall between I am off of work, if there isn't the practice of having like a re-onboarding in your organization, that's something you could set up. And so you could contact HR and say, my first week back, I want to set up meetings with my supervisor and the two colleagues I work most closely with. Can you make that happen? Can you set that up on my calendar? And so then you have the time on your calendar with those people, and you're not kind of like waiting to catch them in the bathroom, in the hallway to share your news. And in that other scenario of returning and then realizing, I think I'm trying to remember if I said this in the first interview we did, but most people will go through a time in their life where they are needing to care for someone else or need to care for themselves. And so that is why we have a Family Medical Leave Act. That is why we have leave of absences. That is why you talked about the personal time you used. And so I think even in work scenarios, like you are human first. And if you are in a situation where you can share why you're making the decision, then it can humanize the decision a little more and can prevent any feelings of like you doing this from a place of like not wanting to be at work or not like being a team player, when the reality is you have other needs right now and you are trying to figure out a way to have those needs met.
And I did mention this in our first conversation about being a first generation professional. And it's really hard to really navigate the workplace, and not to mention this new topic where oftentimes we don't know how to really approach these kinds of conversations because our parents perhaps never had professional jobs where they weren't able to, kind of like amplify their voices and talk about these kinds of conversations, right? And so for our parents, this may seem like a luxury and even approaching our boss whether to return back to work or not because they didn't have that option. And so it definitely gives perspective about that. And I'm glad that, the work that you do, you can support and validate, like women's experiences and feelings about this big transition, whether to return back or not, you know? And as far as with those that decide not to go back to work, like how far in advance should we plan if this goal can be met? Is it something more so on the financial side of things that we need to consider? Or bringing this with your partner if you are in a relationship, like what are your recommendations as far as with planning if you decide not to go back to work?
Yeah, so financial planning is a big part of it. It sounds like that factored into your own decision. And again, if you're thinking about this return period as kind of part of the natural arc of your maternity leave, then while you're planning out your leave can be a great time to think about like, oh, do I need to think about financially what these next few months will look like? And particularly for people who are in states where they don't have paid leave or they don't have paid leave through their job. So there can be a lot of financial kind of projecting that you end up having to do, and the babies are expensive. And then um, thinking, just like making a quick list of like who would the people that I would need to consult or inform on this decision. So that could range from like your partner and just conversations you might be having, people in your personal life, mentors. And then on the informed side, it can be about the conversations you'll need to set up, both with work colleagues, but also maybe with family or kind of friends slash colleagues who might be part of your life in and outside of work. So having kind of a conversation list of the people who you will set up time to speak with is another thing that I often see.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So, as far as with both, either working professionals, stay at home moms, or, those that decide to go back to work or not, like, how can we mentally prepare ourselves to avoid or prevent postpartum mood disorders?
So I will just normalize that 1 in 4 families is affected by perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. The acronym for it is PMADS. And some of the latest research shows us that actually like up to 18% of people may be affected by depression in pregnancy and postpartum, and even slightly higher for anxiety, again, in pregnancy and postpartum. And so familiarizing yourself with what those symptoms look like, and familiarizing other people in your life who you know will be close to you and around you in those moments with what it will look like. And oftentimes the kind of threshold for those symptoms is if they persist after 2 weeks of postpartum. And so if they are persisting and you're experiencing things like a lot of crying, a lot of rage as well, intrusive thoughts, not being able to kind of go about your day without having these thoughts pop into your mind about what will happen, or kind of intense worries throughout the day, then that is, so there's some indicators that you could benefit from additional support. I think on the first call, we talked a lot about Postpartum Support International, which is one of my favorite resources. And that is a way to get connected with professional services. And your medical provider is a kind of referral path to getting support as well. For this podcast in particular, I always say like it's not that you hear a lot about like mental health having genetic aspects, and I always like to say that like the social systems we live in are also affecting our mental health, and we can't ignore that we live in a system with a lot of different social oppression layers and discrimination in our lives, and that there's a wonderful study called Listening to Mothers, and they've had 3 different waves of data collection at this point. So what we know, and they've sampled a very diverse group of mothers, and we know that the disparities for Latinas in particular are persistent over time. And I think particularly for not having access to the emotional support you need, one of the waves of the Listening to Mothers study found that 18% of Latinas were likely to respond to not having the amount of support that they needed in their lives, compared to 5% for white counterparts. So exponentially higher. Yeah. So the reality is we all need support. And if you're in high stress situations, which pretty much describes all all phases of early parenthood, high
Yes.
stressful situations, then we need to often double down on the support
Mm.
that we bring into our lives, which can be hard if you are used to doing a lot of things for yourself and not always, sometimes it you feel like it's easier to do things yourself or push through. This would be the period of time where accepting help is a skill that will come in handy.
Yes, absolutely. Especially with us growing up with mamas who were always like, they always put themselves last, right? Like they always put themselves either at the back burner or their emotions, feelings, and they just like worry and prioritize on like the people in front of them. And I'm like, no, we also need to think about ourselves and prioritize on ourselves. And I'm really glad that at least in this generation we are talking about it, right? We are normalizing that it is okay to feel this way and there is support out there. And so thank you for so much for sharing PSI. I'm all for it as well. I love the resources that they share, and they also have these like subgroups for specific populations, so like Spanish speaking populations and the Latina population, in terms of prioritizing on ourselves as working professionals. Like, how do we set that balance between work and life? And also for those that decide to be stay-at-home parents, how do we really set boundaries between being this on-call parent 24/7 without any breaks? Like, what are your recommendations for both kind of scenarios?
So I would say a key thing that, again, crosses over either of those identities, as working parent, stay at home parent, is that we all need to find ways to prevent feelings of isolation. Like you'd be amazed at how much social interaction or work interaction you could have, and you still aren't able to find like moments of connection for yourself. And a lot of the postpartum mental health literature is kind of links back to feelings of isolation, and how that can exacerbate mental health outcomes over the longer term. And the reality is our society does not have great like built-in support for new mothers. So it often means that if you are looking to create moments of connection for yourself, you have to build it or seek it out or really deliberately find ways to have that come into your life. And that social support can look a lot of different ways. So sometimes it is kind of emotional connection or support, having someone in your life who's a great listener to you, and you might play that role for others as well. And sometimes it's what's referred to as like material support or instrumental support. And that's like who can drop off a hot meal when you need it? Who, when they are out grocery shopping, will text you and say, I'm at the store, do you need anything? So, and save you a trip for that, from that, like those two things, those two missing ingredients that you otherwise would have had to go to the store for. And so again, I'll come back to something I said earlier, which is assessing where you want those moments of connection, what those moments of connection work or would feel like to you. So not everyone, introverts, extroverts, ambiverts, not everyone finds connection through the same ways, or one way of that someone might feel really connected and really supported might not bring the same sense of connection and support for another person. And so identifying that for yourself, and what I mentioned earlier again of being able to ask for the type of support that you want and then receive it. And sometimes I think the hard part is sometimes when people help, it might not be the perfect way, the perfect help you envisioned coming your way. Like if someone says, yes, I will bring this to you from the grocery store, and they get some brand that you do not normally get, and you get a feeling of like, oh, that was not helpful in the way I thought it was going to be helpful. But being able to say, okay, I needed, this is a moment where I'm just going to accept the help that was given, even if it wasn't like the way I thought the help was going to show up.
Sure. Yeah. And it takes a village to raise a baby, as we all know that saying, right? But it also takes a village to really navigate this identity as a parent, as a mom, whether if you do decide to go back to work or not. Do you have any final tips or advice that you have for Latina moms as we wrap up our conversation here?
Well, I will share from something that my midwife shared with me that I always carry around as such a nugget of useful information. So maybe it will be for others. But on the identity piece, one concept, I had my son in Mexico, and one concept that the midwife shared with me was preparing for, she called it la pequeña muerte. And I was studying maternal mortality at the time, so I was like, I don't want anything associated with ni pequeñas muertes ni grandes muertes. But she was like, hear me out. And it's a concept passed on primarily through indigenous midwifery in Mexico of when a child is being born, that there is a pequeña muerte of the mother. There's a little death of the mother, and because you have to go through a rebirth of who you are. You are not going to be the same exact person that you were on the other side of that birth. And I just love that concept because it brings up the reality of you might grieve for that old you, or you might grieve for that old life, and we associate grief as a normalized part of death, right? But not grief and a new baby don't always go hand in hand. And so kind of realizing that grief can also be a normal feeling, and that it is a major transition to the degree that people talk about it as a little death. And I always just found that really helpful for dealing with all the emotions that come up with new parenthood.
Yes. Oh, I love this. It definitely gives perspective, about that experience, right? Of you kind of lost a little part of yourself, but you're in this new life, and we have to honor both sides, and it's okay to grieve. And definitely that was a struggle, especially for new mamas who are in this new identity, right? Oftentimes we don't talk about that grieving process. And I think it's definitely important to normalize that and talk about it. And if anyone needs support out there, there is professional help. And I cannot stress that there are people that are literally dedicated with postpartum mood disorders, perinatal help. And I will definitely reference that in the show notes. So thank you so much for being here and sharing all of your wisdom. I've learned a lot. I think that there's a lot of insightful information that you shared. And so where can people follow you?
Yeah, so theexpectingentrepreneur.com is a website where all the things, if this is their jam, if you're looking for more information on this, you can link to all the resources and the book. And then on social media, I'm on Instagram and spend some time on LinkedIn. So I'm happy to connect with anyone on those as well.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'll make sure to share that in the show notes as well. Well, Ariana, thank you so much for being here. Hopefully some mamas can gather a couple nuggets that you shared here, especially if they are currently on maternity leave, because there's just a lot of helpful information you shared. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Viva la Mami podcast. If you like this episode, make sure to leave a review and write what episode really resonated with you. If you really loved it, share it on social media or with an amiga. As always, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you are listening. Make sure to follow me at Viva la Mami on Instagram or visit vivalamami.com. Please note the information shared in this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be replaced by your healthcare provider nor taken as professional advice.